my blissful selves. Today, let us know in brief the conquering of six enemies. These six enemies are desire, anger, craziness, greed, egoism, and jealousy. So, why we have to conquer these six enemies? We have to conquer these six enemies because the six enemies give us unhappiness. And when we conquer these six enemies, we will be happy. That is why we have to conquer them. So we have the desires in our mind for these sensory objects. Why there is the desire in our mind of the sensory objects? So we have thought that the sensory objects are givers of bliss. So you desire them. For example, when we see the TV program for a long duration, so there will be a burning sensation in our eyes. And later, there will be diseases to our eyes. And when we go on seeing the TV program, at the end, the mind will be tired. And the mind will be having the desires of the sensory objects. So, this clearly indicates that there is no happiness in sensory enjoyment. And if we analyze the experience of deep sleep, in a deep sleep, there is no gross body and there are no sensory objects. But yet there is happiness. Why? In a deep sleep, we know whether there is anybody or not. We know whether anything is known or not. We know whether there is happiness or not. So, who knows all these? I only know all these. So, in deep sleep, I remain as the knower of all these, and there is nothing else other than me. So, the happiness that is enjoyed during deep sleep is the happiness of my true self. When we get the desired sensory object, our mind becomes calm. And in that calm mind, the happiness of our true self is reflected and experienced. But yet we have not experienced the sensory object. Later, we begin to enjoy the sensory object and our mind becomes calm. And in that calm mind, the happiness of our true self only reflected and experienced. But wrongly we understand that the happiness is experienced and which is due to sensory objects. So, at every gross of food, every sight of form, at every smell, at every touch, and at every hearing, we think that the happiness is of sensory objects only. So, as we go on enjoying the sensory objects, the understanding that the sensory objects give happiness gradually strengthens, and the desire for word, touch, form, taste, and smell also strengthens. As we go on enjoying the sensory objects, there will be tiresomeness and weariness. So, when we will be trying to get the sensory objects, and if there will be anybody who can become an obstacle to get the desired object, there arises anger. When the anger arises, the intellect is caught by the anger. Then the intellect loses the power of reason to know which is morality and which is immorality, what is truth and what is untruth, what is happiness and what is unhappiness. So, in the pit of anger, man talks like anything, and he does sinful actions and gets a lower birth, and lastly, he perishes. So, as we go on enjoying the sensory objects, there is increase in craziness and greed. So, this leads to egoism and jealousy. When we firmly don't know that the happiness is not at all in sensory objects, all the six enemies are destroyed. Like this, we can conquer the six enemies like desire, anger, craziness, greed, egoism, and jealousy. Then only we can experience the permanent happiness. If we remember the sensory objects, we will have all these six enemies. And also there will be the enemies will be there outside. But if we forget the sensory objects in a deep sleep, there will be no enemies in the mind or no enemies outside. And if that is the case, if we remember our true self, we experience permanent happiness because our true self is of the nature of happiness. And when we experience permanent happiness, then there will be no desire to enjoy the sensory objects. And there will be nobody who can become an obstacle to get the sensory objects. And there will be no anger at all, no sinful talk, no sinful actions, and no heinous births, and no perishing of life. So, if this understanding that the sensory objects are no givers of happiness, so there will be no craziness, no greed for sensory objects, and there will be no egoism that I have only experienced the permanent happiness, and there will be no jealousy so that others enjoy the happiness. So there will be no six enemies in the mind and no enemies outside. Like this, if we remember one's own true self for longer duration, one attains jnana samadhi and becomes free from all unhappiness. And then there doesn't arise any desire to enjoy sensory objects, and there will be no rebirth at all. So, when there is a body consciousness, then there arises the desire to enjoy the sensory objects. But when we try to know of our real nature, we will come to know that we are not this gross body. Because when we are living, we talk. But we don't talk when we die. That means we are talkers. So, for talking, there is the necessity of consciousness. That means our real nature is consciousness. And consciousness is happiness. In deep sleep, we remain as consciousness by forgetfulness and we experience happiness. But in waking state, we remain as a gross body and unhappiness is experienced due to body consciousness. So there is the hunger, the thirst, there is cold, there is heat, there is sultriness, there is insult, there is old age, and there is the desire to enjoy the sensory objects, and there is the fear of death. So, when there is a body consciousness, all these will be there. Usually, we try to experience permanent happiness by sensory objects, by enjoying the sensory objects. But the sensory organs cannot perceive the happiness. So our eyes can perceive the form, the nose can perceive the smell, the tongue can perceive the taste, the skin can perceive the touch, and the ears can perceive the words, but they cannot perceive the happiness concerned. And if we try to seek happiness in sensory objects, because sensory organs cannot perceive the happiness, they can perceive the sensory objects. And if we try to be permanently happy by enjoying the sensory objects, it is impossible to get happiness. And if we know this, there will be no enemies in the mind or no enemies outside. The happiness can be only perceived by calm mind. So, to become happy, what we have to do is to make our mind calm. really thinking we are happiness ourselves, but we make our mind agitated, and our happiness nature is not experienced. Why the mind becomes agitated? When we see our face in the mirror, which is clean and firm, then only our face of gross body is reflected in the mirror. So, our face of gross body, this one, can be reflected in the mirror if the mirror is clean and if the mirror is calm, that is clean and firm, then only we can see, or the face of our gross body can be reflected. But the mirror which experiences happiness is our mind. And if at all our real face, that is happiness, can be only experienced when our mind is clean and when our mind is firm, then only we can experience the reflection and the experience of permanent happiness. So, to become permanently happy, we have to make our mind calm. And if we make our mind calm, and if we transcend our gross body consciousness, and if we stand firmly in our true self, then only we can experience permanent happiness. So, in this way, if we know that the happiness is not in the sensory objects, the happiness is not in the gross body consciousness, and if the happiness is in our true self, and if we try to stand firmly in our true self, then only we can experience permanent happiness. And by standing firm in our real self, so the permanent happiness can be experienced. And all these six enemies will be destroyed. So, this is the way how exactly we can conquer the six enemies, that is desire, anger, craziness, greed, egoism, and jealousy, and even the outside. The outside enemies also can be destroyed. The enemies in the mind also will be destroyed, and we can experience permanent happiness. So, by this, I end my talk.